The vanishing. The hum of an old coffee machine filled the kitchen, releasing the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Sarah Mitchell poured herself a cup, her eyes flickering between the digital clock on the stove and the early morning sunlight creeping through the window. 6:45 a.m. right on time. Ben, hurry up. You don't want to be late for your trip. She called up the stairs. Thudding footsteps followed almost immediately as Ben came rushing down, his tousled brown hair sticking up at odd angles. His eyes sparkled with excitement, and he barely slowed down before plopping into his chair. I'm coming, he said, stuffing half a piece of toast into his mouth. Sarah smirked, shaking her head. Slow down before you choke. I won't, Ben said, his words muffled by the food. Owen and I are going to find the biggest leaves ever at Meadow Ridge, and Miss Bennett said we might even see deer. Sarah smiled as she packed his lunchbox, slipping in a granola bar and a small note she always wrote for him on special days. Just promise me you'll stay with your teachers and not wander off, okay? Ben groaned dramatically. Mom, I'm not a baby. Sarah zipped up his backpack. I know, but humor me. Fine. He sighed, stuffing the last bite of toast into his mouth. As they stepped outside, the crisp autumn air greeted them. Leaves crunched underfoot as they walked to the car, the driveway littered with red and orange foliage. As she buckled Ben into his seat, a strange feeling of unease settled in her chest, a quiet, nagging sense that something wasn't quite right. She brushed it aside. It was just another school day. The school parking lot was bustling when Sarah pulled in. Parents stood in small groups, chatting and snapping pictures of their children in front of the school bus parked at the curb. Teachers checked permission slips, marking off each student. Ben barely waited for the car to stop before unbuckling his seatbelt. Bye, Mom, he called, grabbing his backpack and leaping out. Wait, your jacket. Ben groaned, but took it before darting toward his friends. Sarah smiled as she watched him join Owen and a few other kids, their excitement contagious. Then her eyes landed on the driver. A man she didn't recognize sat behind the wheel. Her brow furrowed. Where was Mr. Harris? He had always driven the school trips. This man was middle-aged, with thinning hair and a crisp uniform, but something about him felt off. His face was neutral. Too neutral. He sat rigidly, barely acknowledging the parents or the children boarding. A teacher, Miss Diane Sullivan, approached the bus, frowning slightly. Where's Mr. Harris? She asked. The driver, Raymond Turner, offered a polite but clipped smile. Called in sick last night. I'm his replacement. He held up a clipboard with paperwork. His tone was smooth, rehearsed, too rehearsed. Miss Sullivan hesitated, her fingers brushing over the paperwork. Everything seemed legitimate, but she was still frowning. Sarah's unease deepened. Her gut told her something wasn't right, but she had no reason to argue. Ben had already climbed onto the bus, waving at her through the window with a big grin. The doors shut with a faint hiss, and the bus rolled away from the curb. Sarah stood there a moment longer, watching it disappear down the street, that unsettling feeling lingering in her gut. Hours later, Sarah was wiping down the kitchen counter while the news played in the background. She wasn't paying much attention until the anchor's urgent tone caught her ear. Breaking news. An urgent situation is unfolding in Riverdale. A school bus was discovered abandoned on a remote road, its doors open and its seats empty. All 15 children and 2 staff members who were on board are missing. The plate in Sarah's hand slipped, shattering against the tiled floor. Her breath caught as the screen showed aerial footage of a school bus, parked haphazardly on an isolated dirt road. The bus doors were flung wide open. The seats inside were empty. She scrambled for her phone, dialing the school's emergency line. A recorded message. Our lines are currently experiencing high call volumes. Please hold. Sarah's vision blurred as sheer panic surged through her. Ben was on that bus. When she arrived at the school, she wasn't alone. The parking lot was packed with frantic parents, some crying, others demanding answers. Teachers huddled near the entrance, their faces pale. She pushed through the crowd toward Principal Walters, who stood on the steps, trying to maintain order. "We are working closely with authorities," the principal said, her voice strained but steady. "We ask parents to remain calm while the police investigate." Calm, Sarah thought. How could they be calm? She rushed toward Ben's classroom. His cubby was empty. His backpack, his books, gone. It was like he had never been there. Outside, sirens wailed as police cars pulled into the lot. Officers stepped out, their expressions grave. Detective Elliot Grayson scanned the crowd before addressing the teachers. "We need to know everything about the bus departure." Sarah turned toward him, pulse hammering. She had a feeling she already knew where this was going. Detective Elliot Grayson stepped out of his unmarked sedan onto the gravel road where the school bus had been found. The remote stretch of road was lined with dense trees, casting long shadows in the fading light. The bus sat eerily still, its hazard lights blinking in rhythmic silence. Grayson took a slow breath. There were no houses, no traffic, nothing but wilderness. His partner, Detective Hannah Lawson, approached from the other side of the bus, hands in her pockets. "This isn't where they plan to keep them," she said. "This is just the dump site." Grayson nodded grimly. "We're not dealing with amateurs." Inside the roped-off perimeter, forensic specialists documented the scene. Backpacks still sat on seats, half-zipped. Lunchboxes had toppled over, their contents spilled onto the floor. Near the front, a pink stuffed bunny lay on a seat, untouched. The eerie stillness was suffocating. Then came the first clue. The GPS tracker had been ripped out. A cluster of exposed wires hung from the dashboard, where the bus's tracking system should have been. Grayson ran a gloved hand over the frayed ends. "This was planned ahead of time," he murmured. Hannah nodded. They knew what they were doing. Then came the next clue. A crumpled note wedged between the seats. Hannah pulled it free, her breath catching as she read the scrawled, childlike handwriting. 4 letters. H-E-L-P. The ink was smudged, as if written in a rush. Grayson's jaw tightened. At least one kid knew what was happening. Then, outside the bus, he spotted something in the dirt. A child's sneaker print. Small, deep, positioned like someone had been running. He crouched beside it, brushing a hand over the faint impression. Somebody tried to get away. Hannah's expression darkened. Did they make it? Neither of them had an answer. Back at the precinct, Grayson and Hannah pulled up security footage from the school that morning. Then they saw it. At 6:50 a.m., David Harris, the real bus driver, had never arrived. At 7:00 a.m., Raymond Turner took his place. At 10:34 p.m., the night before, Harris had stopped at a gas station. At 10:37 p.m., he stepped outside. Then the footage cut out. Harris never made it home. And now, the children were gone. The vanishing deepens. Detective Elliot Grayson leaned over the desk in the dimly lit precinct, his eyes fixed on the grainy gas station footage looping on the monitor. The timestamp read 10:34 p.m., marking the last known sighting of David Harris, the school bus driver who should have been behind the wheel that morning. Just 3 minutes later, at 10:37 p.m., Harris walked out of the store. He hesitated at the edge of the frame, his head tilting slightly, as if someone off-camera had called out to him. Then the footage abruptly cut off. Elliot's fingers tightened around his coffee cup, frustration simmering beneath the surface. The surveillance system at the gas station was old, its cameras outdated. But the sudden blackout at that exact moment was no coincidence. Someone had tampered with the footage. Someone had wanted Harris to disappear, ensuring that no digital record existed of what happened next. His partner, Detective Hannah Lawson, sat beside him, flipping through a stack of paper files. Harris's employee records, background checks, and a list of emergency contacts. "I don't like this," she muttered, scanning the documents with a furrowed brow. No criminal record, no debts, no history of trouble, If someone wanted him out of the picture, it wasn't personal. Elliot exhaled slowly. No, it was calculated. The kidnappers needed him gone so they could replace him with Turner. They had this planned long before today. Hannah nodded, setting down the files and rubbing her temples. Turner wasn't working alone. Someone with inside access gave him everything he needed. The school's trip schedule, the students' names, the bus route. This wasn't a random abduction. They had everything mapped out before they even made their move. Elliot glanced at the whiteboard covered in photos, maps, and strings connecting the key players in the case. If Harris was taken, where's his body? His voice was grim. If they wanted him dead, they wouldn't have left loose ends. Hannah didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for another folder, a printout from the traffic cameras that had captured the school bus that morning. She flipped through the still images, pausing on one where the vehicle was last seen intact, rolling through the city at 7:15 a.m. Another image, taken at 8:42 a.m., showed the bus exiting the main highway and veering onto a rural road. Then the trail went cold. "There's a gap," Hannah murmured, running her finger along the timeline. "We tracked it to that isolated dirt road, but that's not where the children were taken. They must have been moved elsewhere." Elliot's phone buzzed, breaking the heavy silence. It was a forensic analyst from the crime scene at the abandoned bus. "Detective, we've confirmed something disturbing. There's no blood inside the bus. No sign of struggle. It's like they just vanished. But we found something you'll want to see." Elliot's stomach twisted. "What is it?" "A partial handprint on the bus door," the analyst replied. "It's small, definitely a child's. And there's something else. Traces of mud and asphalt, not from the dirt road where the bus was found, but from somewhere else." Hannah grabbed her coat. "We need to retrace that bus's path. Whatever happened, it happened before it was abandoned." The drive toward the last known route of the missing bus was filled with an uneasy silence. The police had already blocked off the remote dirt road where the vehicle was found. But Elliot and Hannah weren't convinced that was the real crime scene. Instead, they focused on the missing hour and a half, the window between when the bus left the highway and when it showed up empty. As they followed the most logical route, Hannah's fingers tapped anxiously against the dashboard. If the kids weren't taken at the dump site, where did the switch happen? Elliot kept his eyes on the road, thinking, somewhere quiet, somewhere with cover. They couldn't have risked moving that many people in broad daylight without being seen. Minutes later, they passed a construction site, long abandoned, its skeletal metal framework standing stark against the fading light of the sky. Something about it made Elliot slow the car. Piles of gravel and asphalt littered the edges of the site, matching the forensic report from the bus door. "This could be it," he muttered, pulling over. "Let's check it out." Hannah nodded, unfastening her seatbelt. "If this is where the transfer happened, we need to find what they used to take the kids." They stepped out, their boots crunching against the gravel. The place was eerily quiet, the wind rattling loose metal sheets against scaffolding. As they ventured deeper, their flashlights skimmed over the uneven ground, illuminating faint tire tracks leading toward the skeletal remains of a half-built warehouse. Hannah crouched, running her fingers over the markings in the dirt. "These are fresh. 2 vehicles. One looks like a large transport van." Elliot exhaled sharply. That's what they used to move them. Then, a few feet away, he spotted something partially buried beneath a pile of loose gravel. He knelt and carefully brushed the dirt away, revealing a small blue sneaker. His grip tightened around it. Ben's mother had described exactly what her son was wearing that morning. Blue sneakers, just like this one. "They were here," Hannah said, her voice hollow. Elliot straightened, scanning the empty construction site. If this was where they were taken, then where the hell were they now? Back at the precinct, the pieces were beginning to fall into place. But the full picture was still out of reach. With the evidence from the construction site, forensics confirmed that multiple vehicles had been present that morning. Traffic camera footage, though limited, had shown a white cargo truck and 2 black SUVs, leaving the area just minutes apart. Elliot stood over the operations board, rubbing his temples. They split up. The kids weren't taken together. Hannah frowned. Which means we're not dealing with just one buyer. Elliot exhaled, his frustration mounting. They were up against something bigger than a single abduction case. The level of coordination, the resources, it was far beyond the capabilities of a few rogue criminals. His phone rang, cutting through his thoughts. "Grayson," he answered. A voice crackled through the line. "We've found Harris." Elliot's stomach dropped. "Where?" There was a pause. Then the officer's voice came through, grim and heavy. "Buried at a construction site. Strangled. He never stood a chance." The room went silent. Hannah's expression darkened. This just became a murder investigation. Elliot gritted his teeth. The real bus driver had been executed. The children were missing, and their captors had vanished without a trace. For the first time, he felt a deep, sinking fear. They were running out of time. The trail of shadows. Detective Elliot Grayson stood at the edge of the excavation site, his breath misting in the cold evening air. The dull hum of construction machinery had long since fallen silent, replaced by the murmurs of forensic specialists and the occasional crackle of a police radio. In the dim glow of floodlights, the shallow grave was now fully uncovered, revealing the lifeless body of David Harris. His stiffened form lay partially curled, his uniform crumpled and dirt-streaked, the deep bruising around his neck, a clear indication of strangulation. His eyes were closed, but the terror of his final moments seemed permanently etched onto his face. Elliot exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the scene pressing down on him. This wasn't just a kidnapping anymore. This was an execution, a silencing. Whoever had orchestrated this didn't just need Harris out of the way. They needed him eliminated with absolute certainty. Hannah Lawson stood beside him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her usual composed demeanor visibly strained. "He never saw it coming," she muttered. "They took him fast, killed him faster. And then they just buried him like he was nothing." Elliot nodded grimly, because to them, he was nothing. Just an obstacle. Nearby, forensic analysts worked meticulously, cataloging every inch of the site for evidence. It didn't take long before one of them, a young technician named Carter, signaled the detectives over. He held a small torn piece of dark green fabric, his gloved fingers carefully examining the fibers under the harsh beam of his flashlight. "This doesn't match Harris's clothing," Carter said. "It's from someone else." Elliot took the fragment, feeling the rough texture between his fingers. "Uniform material," he muttered. "This looks like something industrial." Hannah's eyes narrowed. A janitor's uniform. The realization hit them both at the same time. They had been digging into the wrong suspect list. Paul Evans, the school janitor who had mysteriously quit just days before the field trip. Elliot's grip tightened around the fabric. Evans had access to the school. He knew the bus schedules. He could have disabled the GPS tracker. And if he was in on this, he knew Harris would never just call in sick. Hannah pulled out her phone, immediately dialing the number on Evans's employment file, straight to voicemail. No rings, just an automated message. She looked at Elliot, her expression hardening. "He's not just missing, Elliot. He's running." Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was electric with urgency. Officers scrambled across the operations floor, their phones ringing, printers spitting out new reports as they combed through everything they could find on Paul Evans. His personnel file was thin. No criminal record, no priors, just a history of bouncing between custodial jobs in different school districts. But there was something odd about his past employment. He never stayed anywhere for long, Hannah noted, scanning through a list of his former workplaces. Every job lasted less than a year before he left. Elliot leaned over her shoulder, his eyes darting across the records. And he never gave notice, always just disappeared. Hannah clicked through the files, searching deeper. There's no clear reason why he left these jobs. No complaints, no terminations, just vanishing acts. Elliot's mind was racing. What if that's because no one ever thought to question it? A sharp ding from the nearby surveillance station caught their attention. One of the analysts had pulled up the last known security footage of Paul Evans. The timestamp was from 2 days before the field trip. The footage showed him in the school's maintenance corridor, unlocking the door to the storage room where the security systems were housed. He entered, but never re-emerged on camera. Hannah's stomach twisted. That's when he rigged the GPS system. Then the analyst froze, his eyes locked onto the screen. Wait, there's something else. He rewound the footage and zoomed in on Evans's left wrist as he passed under a better-lit section of the hallway. A faint but distinct tattoo peeked out from beneath his sleeve, a coiled black serpent with a dagger through its eye. Elliot's expression darkened. That's not just a tattoo. Hannah's voice was tense. That's a cartel insignia. The revelation shifted the entire investigation. The police had been working under the assumption that this was a localized abduction, someone targeting these kids for personal gain. But this wasn't just a kidnapping. This was trafficking. Elliot wasted no time getting on the phone with Special Agent Mark Carter from the FBI's Organized Crime Division. Carter had been tracking child smuggling rings for years, and when Elliot described the situation, the agent's tone turned grim. "Black Serpent," Carter muttered. "They're not freelancers, Grayson. They're a network. They move kids like merchandise." Hannah clenched her fists. "And Evans is part of them." Carter didn't hesitate. If Evans was inside the school, planting trackers and setting up the job, he wasn't just hired muscle. He was an insider. That means this isn't their first run. Elliot ran a hand over his face, his mind piecing together the sickening puzzle. So they've done this before. In other towns. Other schools. Exactly, Carter confirmed. And if they're following their usual pattern, those kids are already in transport. We have hours, maybe less, before they disappear completely. The precinct erupted into a full-scale manhunt for Paul Evans. A BULO, be on the lookout, alert was issued across state lines. All border checkpoints were notified, and every known associate of Evans and Turner was flagged for questioning. Meanwhile, Hannah was piecing together the next step. The traffickers had split the kids into separate vehicles to avoid drawing attention. But where were they headed? Their usual pattern is to move the cargo between multiple locations before reaching their final buyer, Carter had said. They use warehouses, abandoned properties, anywhere that's off the grid. Hannah's fingers flew across her keyboard as she searched property records, looking for anything that stood out. Then she found it. An old meat processing plant on the outskirts of a neighboring town. It had been shut down for years, left to decay. No recent activity. But someone had just paid cash to lease it last week. She turned to Elliot. That's where they're holding them. Elliot didn't hesitate. He grabbed his radio. We're moving now. The convoy of SWAT and FBI vehicles tore down the empty back roads, their headlights slicing through the darkness. The meat processing plant loomed in the distance, its rusted exterior standing as a forgotten relic of industry. Inside the SWAT command vehicle, the tactical team mapped out their breach strategy. The biggest concern was whether the kidnappers would use the children as hostages if cornered. The last thing they wanted was to start a shootout with innocent kids inside. Hannah adjusted her earpiece, listening as the drone team surveyed the area. "We've got movement," came the report. 2 armed hostiles outside, standing near the entrance. 2 more inside. And the heat signatures. We count at least 15 bodies. Elliot gritted his teeth. That was the kids. A voice crackled through his earpiece. "Stand by for breach." Then, in the distance, a low guttural sound carried on the wind. The sound of a large truck engine roaring to life. They were trying to move the children. "Go, go, go," Elliot barked into the radio. The tactical team rushed forward. The next few moments would decide everything. Would they get to the children in time, or had the traffickers already begun their escape? The midnight raid, the convoy of SWAT and FBI vehicles, came to an abrupt halt a quarter-mile from the abandoned meat processing plant, their engines going dark as agents and officers piled out, their boots crunching softly on the gravel road. The air was thick with the weight of the moment, the sky above moonless, leaving only the faint orange glow of distant streetlights to illuminate the industrial wasteland ahead. From their vantage point, the plant loomed in the darkness, its rusted metal siding peeling away like dead skin. Large sliding doors at the front remained partially open, revealing slivers of dim interior lighting. A tall chain-link fence surrounded the perimeter, topped with razor wire, though parts of it were sagging, a sign of recent use. Inside the command truck, Detective Elliot Grayson and Special Agent Mark Carter stood over a digital map of the facility, red dots marking the locations of heat signatures captured by the drone team. The figures were scattered. 2 armed guards patrolled the exterior. 2 more were positioned inside near the main entrance, and the remaining heat signatures clustered deeper into the structure. The children were inside. Hannah Lawson, standing to the side, listened intently to the audio surveillance feed being transmitted from a hidden drone hovering just above the plant. Faint voices crackled through the radio. "Boss said we move in an hour. You sure they got the payment ready?" "Yeah. Overseas buyers are locked in. We load them up, hit the drop point, and by tomorrow, they're ghosts." Hannah's fingers curled into fists. Overseas buyers. This wasn't just trafficking. This was an international operation. If they lost the children tonight, they would never be found again. Elliot's voice was low but firm. "We don't have an hour. We move now." The breach. SWAT moved in like shadows, their weapons raised as they navigated the overgrown lot surrounding the facility. The air smelled of rust and decay, the faint scent of old, rotting meat still clinging to the walls of the plant. The sniper team had already taken their positions on nearby rooftops, their scopes trained on the 2 guards pacing outside the main entrance. Standing by, target acquired. Elliot gave the order. "Take the shot." 2 muffled pops echoed in the night. Both guards dropped instantly, their bodies crumpling into the dirt without a sound. "Go," Carter whispered, and the SWAT team rushed forward, reaching the side of the building. Using a set of bolt cutters, an officer clipped through the fence, creating an opening just wide enough for them to slip through. They moved swiftly toward the rear entrance, stacking up against the rusted door. Inside, the voices of the remaining traffickers were still audible, their conversation casual, unaware of the storm that was about to break. Hannah took a deep breath and nodded to Elliot. Breaching in 3, 2, 1. A deafening explosion erupted as the door was blown open, sending a shockwave through the facility. Flashbangs sailed inside, detonating with blinding light and concussive force, the walls trembling under the impact. "Go, go, go." SWAT stormed inside, rifles raised, the beams of their tactical flashlights slicing through the darkness. Screams erupted, chaos unfolded in an instant. One of the armed kidnappers stumbled backward, blinded by the flashbang, reaching for his weapon. But before he could even aim, a SWAT officer took him down with a single controlled shot. Another trafficker tried to run, bolting toward the side door, but Hannah cut him off, slamming him against the wall and wrenching his arm behind his back. He screamed in pain as the metal cuffs snapped around his wrists. Meanwhile, Elliot pushed deeper into the building, scanning for the children. Then he heard it, crying. A small, terrified sob. He turned sharply and found a locked storage room, its heavy metal door bolted shut. "Kids are in here," he shouted. One of the SWAT officers rushed forward, setting a charge against the door. Fire in the hole. Another explosion rocked the building as the door was blasted open, the metal warping under the force. Inside, 15 frightened children and 2 teachers huddled together, their faces streaked with tears, their hands bound with zip ties. The stench of fear was palpable. For a split second, none of them moved. They were frozen, their eyes wide, their bodies trembling. They had been living a nightmare. Then, recognition dawned in one child's face, Ben Mitchell. His eyes met Elliot's, and suddenly he lunged forward, throwing his arms around him. "Are we safe?" Ben's voice cracked. "Are we really safe?" Elliot crouched down, gripping the boy's shoulders. "Yeah, kid," he said, voice thick. "You're safe now." The other children burst into tears, clinging to the officers as their restraints were cut, their fear giving way to relief. Miss Laura Bennett, the lead teacher, had been shielding the smallest child with her body. Her lip was split, her wrist bruised, but she was alive. She swallowed hard, barely believing what she was seeing. I thought no one was coming," she whispered. Hannah knelt beside her. "We're here," she said gently, "and you're all going home." The escape. Outside, the remaining traffickers were in full retreat. One of them, Paul Evans, had bolted the moment the raid started, disappearing into the dense woods behind the plant. Elliot stepped outside just as the SWAT team reported over the radio. "Suspect Evans is on foot, heading east through the forest, moving fast." "Then we move faster," Elliot growled. He broke into a sprint, his heart pounding as he chased after the fleeing figure, his flashlight bouncing against the dark underbrush. Branches clawed at his jacket, the forest closing in like a living thing. Ahead, he caught a glimpse of Evans, a shadow weaving through the trees, his breath ragged as he pushed himself forward. Elliot lunged. His shoulder slammed into Evans's back, sending them both crashing to the ground. They rolled, grappling for control, mud and leaves flying as Evans thrashed violently, clawing at Elliot's arms. "You have no idea what you're stopping," Evans spat, his voice venomous. "We had buyers waiting. Do you even understand how deep this goes?" Elliot slammed a fist into Evans's jaw, silencing him with a sickening crack. "You're not selling anyone ever again," Elliot snarled. Evans groaned, trying to push himself up, but before he could recover, Elliot flipped him over and snapped the handcuffs around his wrists. "Paul Evans," he said coldly, "you're under arrest for kidnapping, human trafficking, and murder." The aftermath. By dawn, the plant was fully secured, the captured traffickers transported to federal custody. The children had been reunited with their families, their sobs replaced by tearful embraces. Parents clutched their kids, refusing to let go, their worst nightmares finally over. Sarah Mitchell collapsed to her knees the moment she saw Ben, pulling him into her arms as she wept uncontrollably. "I thought I lost you," she whispered against his hair. Ben hugged her back just as tightly. "I was so scared, Mom," he whispered, "but I knew you'd come." Elliot watched from a distance, his jaw tight. The case wasn't over. There were others out there, other children, other buyers, other captors. But tonight, they had won. And that was enough. For now. Unmasking the network. The warm hues of sunrise painted the sky as the Riverdale Police Department buzzed with frantic activity. The entire station had become the nerve center of one of the most significant human trafficking busts in state history. Officers, federal agents, and forensic experts moved in coordinated chaos, piecing together the information gathered from the raid at the abandoned meat processing plant. Files were stacked high on desks, evidence bags lay tagged and sorted, and computer screens flashed surveillance footage and case updates. Detective Elliot Grayson stood in the heart of it all, a steaming cup of coffee in one hand, his other pressed against his forehead as he processed the overwhelming flood of information. The rescued children had been reunited with their families hours ago, their sobs of terror slowly replaced with cries of relief, but the case was far from over. Across the room, Hannah Lawson was hunched over a table cluttered with crime scene reports. Her sharp eyes flicked between the documents and the digital map displayed on the large monitor. On it, several red dots were spread across different states, each one marking a location connected to the trafficking ring. "What are we looking at?" Elliot asked, setting his coffee aside. Hannah didn't look up. "A pattern," she murmured, dragging a finger along the map. Turner and Evans weren't acting alone. They were small pieces in a much larger operation. Elliot exhaled. "We already knew that." "Yes, but we didn't know just how big this network was," Hannah countered, pushing a case file toward him. "The FBI's Organized Crime Task Force pulled records on similar kidnappings over the past 5 years. Look at the locations." Elliot flipped open the file, his gaze darkening as he skimmed the contents. 5 different school districts, 15 missing children in each case, all vanished under eerily similar circumstances. No survivors, no trace. His stomach turned. "This was never just about our town," he muttered. "No." Hannah leaned back, rubbing her temples. "It's a pipeline. They operate in multiple states, maybe even internationally. They take children in small batches, move them through hidden transport routes, and erase all evidence before anyone can react." Elliot let out a slow breath, his mind racing. How the hell has no one stopped them before? Because they're careful. They don't take too many at once, and they use inside help. Janitors, bus drivers, even low-level school staff who don't raise suspicion. They blend in. "And then they vanish," Elliot muttered. Hannah nodded grimly. "Until now." Paul Evans speaks. Inside Interrogation Room B, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting stark shadows against the cold metal table. Paul Evans, the former school janitor turned trafficker, sat shackled, his wrists locked to the steel loops bolted into the table. His face was swollen from his failed escape attempt, his lips split, his right eye bruised. Across from him, Elliot and Hannah sat in silence, letting the weight of the moment settle. Evans had spent the last 3 hours refusing to say a word, staring blankly at the table as if expecting this to all go away. But now, the game was over. Elliot was the first to break the silence. "We already know you were working with Turner," he said flatly. "We know you helped sabotage the school's security system. We know you disabled the bus's GPS. And we know you were inside the processing plant, moving those kids." Evans exhaled, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing. Hannah leaned forward, her voice sharp. "Turner's talking, by the way." It was alive, but Evans didn't know that. "And guess what? He's throwing you under the bus." Evans's fingers twitched slightly, betraying the first sign of unease. Elliot seized on it. "You want to take the fall alone," he challenged. "Because right now, all the charges, the kidnapping, human trafficking, accessory to murder, they're all sitting on your shoulders. Turner's cutting a deal, which means you get left holding the bag." A muscle in Evans's jaw twitched. Elliot leaned in. "You know what happens to guys like you in prison, Evans." His voice was quiet but lethal. "People inside don't take kindly to child traffickers. You'll never make it past the first month." Evans's face remained neutral, but a flicker of something, fear, crossed his eyes. Hannah played the final card. "You want a deal. This is your last chance. Tell us who's really running this operation." Silence. Then, finally, Evans exhaled sharply, shoulders sagging in defeat. "You think you're getting to them," he muttered, voice hoarse. "You have no idea how high this goes." Elliot's gut tightened. "Try us." Evans swallowed hard, his eyes flicking toward the two-way mirror. He knew there were FBI agents watching. He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "It's not just a few guys smuggling kids," he murmured. "It's a business." Hannah's brow furrowed. "Meaning?" Evans licked his split lip, his breathing shallow. "Meaning there's a market for children. Wealthy buyers. Corporate-backed transport routes. It's all protected. The schools. Just entry points. The bus drivers. The janitors. The teachers. They're just pawns." Elliot felt a chill crawl up his spine. You're saying this is institutionalized. Evans let out a bitter laugh. You really think people like me and Turner came up with this? No. We were just hired to do the dirty work. But the people at the top, they sit in offices. They wear suits. They sign contracts, not ransom notes. Hannah exchanged a look with Elliot. If what Evans was saying was true, they weren't just up against a group of criminals. They were up against a global industry, a larger threat. Back in the main operations room, Special Agent Carter was already on the phone with Homeland Security, escalating the case to an international level. If Evans was telling the truth, the kidnappings were only the beginning, a symptom of something much larger and more insidious. We need full cooperation across multiple agencies, Carter was saying, pacing in front of the large map of trafficking routes. Interpol, Customs, Border Protection. We need to shut down every possible exit point before more kids go missing. Elliot and Hannah stood by, watching the task force spring into action. Officers were digging into financial records, travel logs, corporate connections, anything that could tie legitimate businesses to human trafficking pipelines. Hannah exhaled, running a hand through her hair. This isn't just about the 15 kids we saved, she said quietly. Elliot nodded, his jaw clenched. This is about all the kids we never found. A moment of silence stretched between them, both of them realizing just how deep this rabbit hole went. Then a call came through. The officer at the front desk picked up, listening for a moment before his face turned pale. He turned toward Elliot and Hannah. You're gonna want to hear this, he said gravely. It's one of the missing kids. They just called. The truth in shadows. The station had been humming with chaotic energy since the moment the bust at the abandoned meat processing plant had gone down. Now, however, an eerie silence blanketed the operations room. Officers, detectives, and federal agents froze in place, the gravity of the moment thick in the air. The call from a missing child, one who hadn't been among the rescued 15, had just come in. Detective Elliot Grayson and Hannah Lawson exchanged a look, their hearts pounding as they moved toward the dispatch desk. The officer holding the phone had gone pale, gripping the receiver so tightly his knuckles were white. He pressed a button, switching the call to speaker mode so that the room could hear. "Hello, can you hear us?" Hannah asked, keeping her voice calm but firm. There was a moment of hesitation, then a shaky breath came through the line. The voice of a child, young, a whisper laced with exhaustion and fear. "Please, I don't know where I am." The voice cracked. "I think they forgot me." Elliot's spine went rigid. His mind immediately went into overdrive. "What's your name, kid?" A sniffle. "Daniel. Daniel Carter." A hushed wave of tension rippled through the room. Daniel Carter, a boy who had disappeared 4 months ago from a different school in a completely different state. His case had gone cold, presumed another untraceable victim of the trafficking network. But now he was calling them. "Daniel, listen to me," Hannah said, keeping her voice steady. "Are you alone?" A rustling sound. The boy's breath hitched. Yeah. I think so." "Where are you, Daniel? Look around. Can you see anything?" Another sniffle. Then, "It's dark. I can't see much. It smells bad. Like metal. And oil." Elliot's stomach tightened. That wasn't just any place. That sounded like a transport site. "They left me here. Daniel's voice caught. He started to sob. "I don't know where my friends are. They took them. They took all of them." Elliot's grip tightened on the edge of the desk. "How many?" A sniffle. "I don't know. More than before. They kept saying they had to move them before the raid, that the police were coming." Hannah's hand curled into a fist. "Daniel, do you remember how you got there? Did you hear anything about where they were taking the others?" There was silence, followed by a slow, trembling breath. Then, "Mexico." Elliot and Hannah's eyes locked in immediate understanding. The worst-case scenario was already unfolding. the kids that had been moved. They weren't just being transported to another state. They were being smuggled out of the country. "Stay on the line with us, Daniel," Elliot said, turning toward the officers in the room, already barking orders. "Trace the call. Now." A tech officer was already on it, typing furiously. The signal bounced between 3 different towers, scrambled, likely by the kidnappers' own security measures. Then, finally, the location locked in. An abandoned shipping yard, 5 miles outside the city. "Got it," the officer confirmed. "The call's coming from Dock 17, a decommissioned cargo site." Elliot didn't waste a second. "Mobilize SWAT. We're going now." The last stand. The convoy of blacked-out SUVs and SWAT transport trucks roared down the empty stretch of industrial highway, the red and blue emergency lights flashing against the metallic husks of abandoned warehouses and shipping containers. The abandoned cargo yard sprawled ahead, an expanse of rotting docks, rusting cranes, and massive metal freight containers stacked like a labyrinth. Inside the lead vehicle, Elliot and Hannah checked their weapons. The silence inside the car was suffocating. This time, there wouldn't be an abandoned building or hidden warehouse to search through. This time, the traffickers knew they were coming. This was a final stand. Hannah exhaled, her fingers flexing over the grip of her sidearm. "They'll fight back." Elliot's eyes remained locked on the dark horizon. Then we hit harder. The moment the convoy stopped, the tactical team deployed swiftly, fanning out along the dockyard's perimeter. The faint sound of lapping water against the wooden pylons was the only thing that cut through the silence. A drone hovered overhead, feeding thermal imaging back to the command truck. The screen lit up, dozens of heat signatures. Daniel hadn't been lying. "They're inside the shipping containers," an officer confirmed. "Most of them are smaller figures." "That's the kids." Elliot clenched his jaw. "And the traffickers." A long pause. Then, surrounding them. They weren't planning on giving up. They were prepared for a fight. Elliot adjusted his earpiece. "We go in quiet. When the signal's given, take them down. No one gets out. The battle for freedom." The first team of agents moved in, creeping through the dark alleys of stacked cargo containers. The faint glow of flashlights flickered in the distance, the voices of armed traffickers drifting through the air. One of them laughed. "They really think they're gonna find them all." Another chuckled. "Not before we move the last batch. They'll be out of here by sunrise." Elliot signaled to his team. "Now." Silencers popped in rapid succession. 2 traffickers dropped before they even knew what hit them. Then, in the distance, someone shouted, "**, it's the cops." Gunfire erupted. Suddenly, the night exploded into chaos. Bullets slammed into the metal containers, ricocheting through the air. SWAT officers returned fire, storming the dockyard, using the containers as cover. One of the kidnappers tried to run for a nearby speedboat, but a tactical sniper on the perimeter took him down before he could reach the water. Another one emerged from behind a container, his rifle raised, only for Hannah to spin, fire, and drop him where he stood. The firefight was fast and violent, but the police pushed through. Elliot reached the largest cargo container and immediately kicked the door open. Inside, huddled together, were over 20 children, their faces pale with terror. Daniel sat among them, his wide eyes locking onto Elliot. "You came," he whispered. Elliot reached out. "We got you, kid. Let's go home." The aftermath. By dawn, the traffickers were dead or in custody. Over 27 children had been saved, the largest rescue in recent history. Daniel Carter was escorted out of the dockyard, his tearful parents waiting. When he saw them, he broke down, running straight into their arms. Elliot and Hannah watched from a distance. They had won, but the war wasn't over. As the sun rose over Riverdale, they knew. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning.